That Christmas morning, the snow fell so heavily I had to sweep the steps 3 times before leaving the house. In my hands, I carried a small gift wrapped in red paper and tied with a golden ribbon, so small that no one would think it could change an entire life. My daughter took it, looked at me for a few seconds, and then placed it back into my hands. Without ever opening it, she smiled faintly and said she didn't need it. In that warm room filled with laughter, I stood there, feeling as if the whole world had just slammed its door in my face. What she didn't know was that inside that gift lay the keys to the house I had bought for her family. Before I share this story with you, let me ask, have you ever had a moment when someone you love pushed away the very thing you gave from your heart? If this resonates, hit subscribe, press like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let me take you to that Christmas morning. It was the kind of December morning that makes you believe the world still holds magic. Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals, each flake catching the faint golden glow of the street lamps before melting into the thick, white blanket already covering the ground. The world outside my window looked untouched, as if it had been painted overnight by some patient artist with a love for winter. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer, watching a small cardinal hop across the frozen railing. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's child laughed, his voice muffled by the snow. Inside my little house, the warmth of the fireplace softened the air. The scent of pine from the Christmas tree mixed with the faint aroma of cinnamon rolls cooling on the kitchen counter. I had been up since 5, not because I couldn't sleep, but because Christmas morning always pulled me back to the same quiet excitement I'd felt as a boy. Back then, my father would hum carols as he lit the fire, my mother would be in the kitchen, and my brothers and I would wait for permission to run into the living room. Now, decades later, I found myself doing the same rituals, only this time, I was the father. And my daughter, my only daughter, Claire. Claire used to be the kind of child who could make a room feel brighter just by walking into it. She had a laugh that belonged in summer and a way of holding my hand that made me feel like I could shield her from anything. After her mother passed away, she and I had become inseparable. I learned to braid hair, to pack lunches just the way she liked, to sit through endless school plays and soccer games. I became both parents, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Even when she grew older and the world began to pull her in new directions, there was still an unspoken bond between us, an invisible thread I thought nothing could break. We had our traditions: Sunday morning coffee runs, late-night talks when she couldn't sleep, and the annual Christmas Eve movie marathon where we'd fall asleep on the couch halfway through the second film. But over the past few years, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small things. A call that came later than usual, a visit cut short because she and her husband had other plans. I told myself it was normal, that she had her own life now. But the space between us seemed to grow, almost imperceptibly, until I realized we were living in 2 separate worlds. Her husband, Daniel, was polite enough, always shaking my hand firmly and asking how I'd been. But there was a formality in his tone, a measured distance, as though I were a neighbor rather than family. I never heard him speak ill of me, but I also never heard him speak warmly. It wasn't until later that I would wonder if he'd been the one placing those small wedges of distance between Claire and me. They were struggling financially, that much I knew. The pandemic years had been hard on them. Claire's teaching job barely covered their expenses, and Daniel's small marketing firm had been limping along, losing clients month by month. I'd noticed the little signs. The way she wore the same winter coat for 3 years, the way their holiday decorations grew sparser each season, the way she'd smile and change the subject when I asked how things were going. But she never asked me for help. Not once. And maybe that's why I began to make plans in secret. Because if she wouldn't come to me, I would find a way to come to her. Quietly, without making her feel as though she'd failed. I had done well for myself over the years. My work in property investments had given me more than enough to live comfortably, and I'd never been the type to flaunt it. My house was modest, my car old but reliable, my clothes plain. Most people assumed I was just another retired man on a fixed income, and that was fine with me. Christmas morning felt like the perfect time for surprises. That year, the air inside my home seemed filled with a quiet anticipation. The little gift I had prepared for her sat on the side table, wrapped in deep red paper and tied with a gold ribbon. It looked almost unremarkable. Small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, light enough to make someone think it held a piece of jewelry or a keepsake. But inside was something much bigger. Inside was a new beginning, a chance for her and Daniel to finally have a place they could truly call their own. I imagined her face when she opened it, the way her eyes would widen when she realized what she was holding. I pictured the way she'd look at me, not as the man she saw less and less, but as her father, the man who had always been there. I thought maybe, just maybe, it could bridge the gap that had been quietly growing between us. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire crackled, and the clock ticked toward the moment I'd been waiting for. At that point, I had no reason to think the day would be any different from the Christmas mornings we'd shared before. No reason to suspect that in just a few hours, I would be standing in the middle of her living room with that same little red box in my hands, unopened. No reason to imagine that the look on her face wouldn't be joy, but polite refusal. And yet, that's exactly what was coming. The idea had come to me quietly, like the way the first snow of the season arrives, soft, unnoticed at first. Then suddenly there's a blanket of white. I had been driving home one afternoon in late October when I passed by the little blue house on the corner of Ashwood and Pine. It was small but solid, with a wraparound porch and a sloped roof that looked like it belonged in a postcard. There was a "For Sale" sign out front, half buried in leaves that had blown in from the park across the street. Something about it stopped me. I pulled over and sat there for a moment, watching the place through the windshield. I imagined Claire standing on that porch in the spring, leaning against the railing with a mug of tea in her hands. I could almost hear the sound of my grandson's future laughter bouncing through those windows, even though he didn't exist yet. It felt right. Not extravagant, not something that would draw attention, but a place she and Daniel could make their own. The truth was, I had been quietly saving for something like this for years. Not because they'd asked, but because I'd seen enough life to know that sometimes the best help is the help no one asks for. I'd been setting aside portions of rental income, keeping it in a separate account. I told myself it was for family emergencies, but deep down, I knew I wanted to give Claire something lasting, something she could build a future on. The following week, I arranged a viewing with the real estate agent. Stepping inside, I was met with that familiar scent of wood polish and faintly old carpet. The living room had a large bay window that caught the morning sun, and the kitchen, though outdated, had enough space for family dinners and messy Sunday breakfasts. The bedrooms were modest, but I didn't care. This wasn't about square footage. It was about stability, roots, and the quiet message that she wasn't alone, no matter what her life looked like now. The paperwork moved quickly. The owner, a widow moving to be closer to her daughter, was eager to sell before the snow came in heavy. By mid-November, the house was mine. And then came the question, how do you give someone a gift like this without making them feel indebted? How do you make it feel like love instead of rescue? And that's when the idea of the Christmas surprise took shape. I would wrap the house key in a small velvet box, the kind you'd expect to hold a piece of jewelry. Inside, beneath the key, I'd tuck a folded note. "This is for you, Claire. A place for your Christmases, your quiet mornings, your storms and your sunshine. No conditions, no repayments. Just my love, made solid in bricks and beams. Merry Christmas." I imagined her opening it slowly, maybe teasing me with guesses before lifting the lid. I pictured the way her hands would fly to her mouth, the way she'd turn to Daniel, eyes wide, as though she couldn't quite believe it. I pictured the moment she'd throw her arms around me, maybe crying into my shoulder like she did when she was a little girl who just scraped her knee. And, I'll admit, I imagined the way Daniel's expression might shift. How the tight reserve he always carried might crack just enough to show gratitude. I didn't do it to win his approval, but I can't deny that part of me hoped it might bridge the distance between us. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, I guarded the secret like a fragile flame. Every phone call from Claire was a small test of my patience. There were moments when I almost let it slip, moments when I wanted to ease the tension in her voice by saying, "Don't worry, I've got something that will change everything." But I held back. Surprises are only powerful when they're unexpected. The night before Christmas, I sat at my kitchen table with the gift in front of me. The box was wrapped in deep red paper, the ribbon perfectly tied, not too formal, not too messy. I ran my hand over it, feeling the slight bump where the key rested inside. Still, it was light, deceptively so, considering what it represented. Snow was falling steadily outside, piling on the porch steps. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the fire, thinking about all the Christmas mornings we'd shared. I remembered Claire at 6 years old, waking me up before dawn, her small hands tugging at mine, insisting Santa had been there. I remembered her at 15, pretending she was too old for surprises, but still smiling when she found a book she'd been wanting under the tree. This year felt different. She and Daniel had invited me to their place for Christmas morning. It had been years since we'd celebrated there, and the invitation had warmed me more than I expected. I told myself this was a good sign, that maybe the space between us was beginning to close. I went to bed that night with a quiet sense of anticipation. In the morning, I dressed in my thickest sweater, slipped the little box into the inside pocket of my coat, and stepped out into the cold. The air was sharp, the kind that turns your breath to smoke instantly. I brushed snow off my car, my hands already numb, and drove slowly through the quiet streets. As I pulled up to their house, I saw lights glowing through the curtains and the faint silhouettes of movement inside. For a moment, I just sat there, the engine idling, watching my daughter move between the kitchen and the living room. There was something deeply comforting in that sight. A reminder that no matter the changes, no matter the distances, she was still my little girl, making coffee on Christmas morning. I took a deep breath, stepped out into the snow, and walked up to the door. Daniel answered, greeting me with that polite half-smile he always wore. Claire appeared behind him, cheeks flushed from the warmth inside. "Merry Christmas, Dad," she said, wrapping her arms around me. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I replied, holding her for a moment longer than usual. Inside, the tree stood in the corner, its lights blinking gently. The smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee filled the air. Gifts were piled beneath the branches, and the sound of soft carols drifted from a speaker on the shelf. I took a seat, my heart beating a little faster as I slipped my coat off and kept the box within reach. The moment was coming. At least, that's what I thought. At first, everything felt exactly as I'd pictured. Claire poured me coffee in the mug I'd given her years ago, the one with the chipped handle she still insisted on using. Daniel made small talk about the weather, how the roads had been slippery coming back from his brother's the night before. I nodded, sipped, smiled in all the right places. The box in my pocket felt like a living thing, each heartbeat of mine thudding against it. When Claire handed me a gift to open first, a scarf she'd knitted herself, I laughed softly, touched by the time it must have taken. We went around in a comfortable rhythm, paper tearing, bows being untied, that familiar holiday shuffle of your turn now. And then I reached for it, the little red box. I didn't make a speech. I didn't want to turn it into a performance. I simply placed it in her hands, watching the gold ribbon glint in the soft light. "This one's for you," I said, my voice warm but steady. She looked down at it, brow furrowing slightly. Her fingers traced the ribbon, but didn't pull. Instead, she glanced at Daniel, and something unspoken passed between them. He gave the faintest shrug. And then Claire smiled. Not the wide, genuine smile I'd imagined, but a small, polite curve of the lips. She set the box back into my hands. "Dad, you didn't have to get me anything." "I wanted to," I said, still holding it out. "I know," she replied gently, "but really, I don't need anything right now." The room stayed warm. The lights still twinkled, but I felt the air shift. It was as if every carol, every clink of mugs, every soft crackle of the fire had been pushed just out of reach. My hand, still holding the box, felt heavier than it should. I glanced at Daniel. He was leaning back in his chair, gaze fixed on the tree, not meeting my eyes. Something in my chest tightened. I could have insisted. I could have said, "Open it, please." But the look on her face told me this wasn't about the gift. It was about something else. Pride? Distance? Or maybe a wall I hadn't seen building itself between us over the years. I set the box down beside me. "All right," I said quietly. "Another time, maybe." She nodded, already reaching for another gift under the tree. The moment passed for them, but not for me. In that little red box, in the key wrapped beneath its velvet lining, was months of planning, years of saving, and decades of wanting her to feel safe. And now it sat unopened, inches from my hand, as if none of it mattered. I sat there, the unopened box still warm from her hands, and for a long moment, I didn't hear the laughter or the crackle of the fireplace. All I could hear was the faint thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. She hadn't even untied the ribbon. She hadn't even shaken it or asked what it was. Just handed it back. I told myself it wasn't personal, but the truth pressed heavier with each passing second. It was personal. Not in the way of malice, but in the way of someone who had decided, somewhere along the years, to place a polite boundary between us. A line I didn't remember drawing. I tried to smile, to let the moment glide away like so many other small disappointments between family members. But the weight in my chest didn't move. I looked at her. Really looked. Claire was still my little girl in some ways. The slope of her shoulders, the way she tilted her head when she listened. But there was a new stiffness there, like her skin no longer fit the way it used to. Daniel's gaze remained on the tree. He reached for another cookie, said something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. I wondered if this had been discussed between them beforehand. If my gift, my presence, had been anticipated and neatly filed away under unnecessary. The coffee in my mug had gone lukewarm. I took a sip anyway, more for the excuse to pause than the taste. My eyes wandered over the room. The garland draped over the mantel, the little nativity scene I'd carved for her when she was 12, still there but half buried behind a stack of scented candles. A home filled with warmth. Yet, in that moment, I felt like an uninvited guest. I'd imagined her joy so vividly, her tearing open the paper, her eyes widening at the sight of the key, the flood of relief when she realized she'd never have to worry about rent again. Instead, the key sat in its velvet bed, a useless secret in a box that no one wanted to touch. It's strange how rejection can be so quiet. No raised voices, no cruel words. Just the gentlest refusal, and yet it can cut deeper than anything else. I set the box on the coffee table, but the space around it seemed to grow colder. I told myself I'd try again later, maybe after dinner, when the wine had softened the edges of the day. But deep down, I already knew I wouldn't. That window had closed. The rest of the afternoon moved forward as though nothing had happened, but the undercurrent between us had shifted. I laughed at the right moments, complimented the turkey, admired the way Claire had decorated the dining room. Yet, each time my gaze drifted toward that little red box, it felt like a weight pressing against my ribs. Daniel grew more talkative as the evening wore on, but his words had the polished ease of someone who wanted to fill the air without touching anything real. He asked about my health, the weather in my neighborhood, the football game I supposedly watched last weekend. Not once did he mention the gift. Not once did he ask. Claire seemed almost relieved to avoid the topic, moving briskly from one conversation to another. When her eyes did meet mine, it was with that practiced warmth people use when they're trying to reassure you everything is fine, even when it isn't. I caught myself wondering if I'd misjudged the whole thing. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe giving her something so significant, so life-changing, in front of Daniel had put her in an impossible position. But another part of me, the quieter, older part, recognized the truth. The distance between us wasn't born in that moment. It had been growing in the cracks for years. After dessert, I offered to help clear the table. Claire declined politely, telling me to relax. I stood there anyway, gathering plates, stacking them neatly. As I turned toward the kitchen, I saw Daniel glance at the box. His eyes lingered a fraction too long, and when they met mine, his expression was unreadable. Later, when the night began to wind down, I slipped my coat on and reached for the box. Claire looked up from where she was folding a blanket over the couch. "You sure you don't want it now?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Keep it for now, Dad. We'll talk soon." I nodded, forcing a smile. "All right." Soon. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the cold was sharper, biting at my cheeks as I walked to the car. The box sat on the passenger seat, the ribbon catching the faint light from the street lamp. I rested my hand on it at a red light, the way you might comfort a sleeping child. Somewhere between her house and mine, I realized I wasn't sure if soon would ever come. And that was the part that frightened me most. Driving away from Claire's house that Christmas night, I felt as though I had been quietly left behind, even though it was me who turned the key and guided the car through the snow. The little red box sat on the passenger seat beside me, silent and unopened, its gold ribbon catching fragments of streetlight as if mocking my intentions. It was supposed to be a bridge back to my daughter, but now it looked more like a sealed vault, holding a piece of my heart she didn't want to see. The tires crunched over the icy road, but inside the car, it was silent. And in that silence, my mind betrayed me. It drifted back to the years when Claire was still my little girl, the years when her smile alone was enough to erase exhaustion, when I could still believe love was something simple, indestructible. I remember her first Christmas. The house was tiny. The roof leaked when the winter rain hammered down, and our Christmas tree was nothing more than a stubby pine with a few strands of silver tinsel. Yet Claire's eyes, God, her eyes were wide with wonder. She was barely 2, still stumbling through words. But when her little fingers touched the cheap plastic ornaments, she laughed as though the whole world had opened for her. I swore that night I would do whatever it took to keep that light in her eyes. That vow carried me through years of long shifts, missed meals, aching muscles, and yet tonight, sitting in a car that felt colder than the night outside, I wondered if somewhere along the way I had lost sight of what really mattered. There were so many Christmases after that. I took extra jobs, worked double shifts, hauled crates until my back nearly broke, all so I could afford the doll she wanted, or the bicycle she begged me for. I can still see her tearing open the wrapping paper, squealing my name as she hugged the gift to her chest. Each laugh, each cry of joy, was like fuel for my soul. I thought that was love. To provide, to sacrifice, to give. But now, staring at that unopened box, I saw the cracks in my belief. Perhaps love had not been about how many hours I worked, or how much I gave. Perhaps it had been about something else, my presence, my listening, my willingness to share time instead of always chasing stability. And I had failed at that part more times than I could count. One memory stung harder than the rest. Claire's school recital. She had begged me for weeks to come. I promised I would, but a last-minute job kept me at the warehouse. When I finally arrived, the seats were emptying, the stage was bare. Claire spotted me from the doorway, her costume still on, her cheeks painted pink, but her smile faltered. She didn't cry, not then. She just walked to me, silent, and put her hand in mine. That silence, more than any tears, haunted me. And perhaps it built the first brick in the wall she would someday raise between us. Now that wall feels impossibly high. Tonight proved it. She didn't refuse the box because she didn't like gifts. She refused it because, in her heart, she no longer knew how to accept something from me without feeling, what? Obligated? Conflicted? Trapped? I don't know. But her smile, the polite one she gave me, wasn't rejection of the present. It was rejection of the bond I was trying to resurrect. When I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me with silence. I carried the box inside and set it on the table. For a long time, I just stared at it. I imagined Claire's face if she had opened it. Would her eyes widen the way they used to? Would she gasp with gratitude, maybe even cry a little? Or would she frown, seeing it as a burden, an intrusion into the carefully walled-off life she had built with Daniel? The thought hollowed me. It wasn't the unopened gift that hurt. It was the realization that my daughter's world no longer had a place for me at its center. I had once been her anchor. Now I was drifting, tethered only by memories. The house seemed to echo with them. I saw her again, small and fragile, asleep against my shoulder on bus rides home. I heard her laughter when I taught her to ride a bike, the sound of her calling, "Dad, watch me," as she wobbled down the driveway. I remembered her clutching her first exam paper with a perfect score, running to me, eyes shining with pride. Each vision was both sweet and cruel. Sweet, because they reminded me of the love we had. Cruel, because they emphasized just how far away she had gone. I wanted to believe she still loved me. That somewhere beneath her adult logic, beneath the influence of Daniel, beneath the distance, there was still the little girl who believed I was her whole world. But tonight, watching her gently push the box back into my hands, I realized that love has many forms. And sometimes, one form quietly withers while another grows. Her love for me hadn't vanished. It had simply shifted, dulled, tucked away into a quiet corner where it no longer glowed like it once did. And that emptiness, it's heavier than loneliness. Loneliness is missing someone who isn't there. Emptiness is realizing they are there, right in front of you, but you can't reach them anymore. That's what I felt as I sat in my kitchen, staring at the little red box that had become a symbol of both my devotion and my failure. Perhaps the cruelest truth of all was this: the past belongs only to me. I carry those warm memories like sacred treasures. But Claire, she has moved forward. To her, the past is just a faded photograph. To me, it is everything. That imbalance, that gulf, is what makes the distance so unbridgeable. And so I sit, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter and the shadows of what once was, aching for a closeness that may never return. The box remains unopened. The key inside remains unused. And my heart, though still beating, feels like it has been quietly locked away. Just like that gift my daughter refused to touch. The house was silent, but not the kind of silence that comforts. It was the hollow sort, the kind that presses against your ears until you feel like you might burst just to break it. The unopened box sat where I had left it on the kitchen table, its red paper bright against the dull wood. I should have gone to bed, but I couldn't. My body ached from the day, but my mind would not rest. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and sat across from the little box, as though it were a guest demanding my attention. In the hours since leaving Claire's house, I had drowned myself in memories. Sweet, bitter, painful. They had all flooded back, filling me with warmth and then draining me with regret. But as the night deepened, a different thought began to surface. Memory, for all its sweetness, cannot change the present. It can only remind us of what we've lost. If I sat here long enough, I might suffocate in that contrast. The warmth of the past, the coldness of now. So I asked myself, what now? That was the question I had been avoiding for years. I thought my life's meaning was bound up in being Claire's father, in protecting her, providing for her, ensuring she never had to fear the world. And maybe, once upon a time, that had been true. But she was grown now, a woman with her own life, her own family, her own walls. If I clung too tightly to the role I once played, I would only strangle what fragile thread still connected us. The realization stung. Being a father had been my identity for so long that I barely recognized myself outside of it. Who was I, if not the man who tucked her in at night, who saved every dollar for her schooling, who built a life around her smile? Now I was just me, and I wasn't sure if that was enough. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the house creak in the cold. For the first time in a long time, I considered that maybe this distance wasn't just her fault, or mine. Maybe it was simply the nature of time, of life. Children grow. They carve new paths. Parents, if they're not careful, become shadows walking behind them. Not hated, not forgotten, just irrelevant. And yet, I couldn't let go. That box still sat there, its ribbon glinting in the lamplight. It held a key, yes, but more than that, it held a question. Do I still matter? If she had opened it, maybe I would have had an answer. Without it, I was left to wrestle with silence. I thought of her words. I don't need anything right now. Gentle, polite, but final. And I realized, perhaps she wasn't wrong. Perhaps she didn't need what I thought she needed. Perhaps I was the one still needing her to recognize the sacrifices I had made, needing her to acknowledge the love that had built every corner of her childhood. But love, I reminded myself bitterly, is not a debt to be repaid. It is a gift, and once given, it is no longer ours to control. That truth was both liberating and devastating. Liberating, because it meant I had done my part. I had loved her fully completely. Devastating, because it meant I might never feel that same love reflected back in the way I yearned for. The clock ticked past midnight. I picked up the box, turning it in my hands. The paper was smooth, the ribbon soft beneath my fingers. I thought of tearing it open myself, of taking out the key and holding it up to the empty room, as if that would prove anything. But I couldn't. It wasn't mine to open. It was hers, and until she was ready, it would remain sealed. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. How strange that the object meant to symbolize generosity now felt like a cage. I had poured so much of myself into it, and yet it sat there mocking me. Not because she rejected the gift, but because she had unknowingly rejected me. Still, somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice whispered, "You are not finished yet." I didn't know what it meant, not fully, but I sensed it wasn't the end of my story. Maybe this distance with Claire was permanent, maybe it wasn't. But either way, I still had life to live. I still had choices to make, lessons to learn, dignity to reclaim. If she couldn't, or wouldn't, see the man behind the father, then perhaps it was time I remembered him myself. I rose from the table, the box still in my hands. Instead of hiding it away in some drawer, I placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. A reminder, yes, but not a wound. More like a marker of transition. From this point on, I told myself, I would not live only for what might be restored. I would live for what I still had. Breath, strength, the chance to shape whatever years remained. But that resolution didn't erase the ache. It sat heavy in my chest, a dull throb that pulsed with every thought of Claire. I knew I would see her again, at dinners, birthdays, holidays, and each time there would be that fragile smile, that polite distance. I wondered if she ever replayed the memories the way I did, if she ever heard my laugh in the quiet, or remembered the nights I carried her sleeping form from the car to her bed, or if, for her, those moments had simply dissolved into the fog of childhood, replaced by the clearer, sharper lines of adulthood. The thought hollowed me, but I forced myself to breathe through it. Because even if she didn't remember, I did. And maybe, in the end, that was enough. My love for her was not invalidated by her silence. It existed, it mattered, because it had been real. That was a truth no unopened box could erase. The fire had long gone cold, but in that moment, something inside me warmed. Not joy, not comfort, but a fragile ember of resolve. Tomorrow, the world would expect me to rise, to move, to keep going. And I would. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only way forward. And maybe one day, when Claire was ready, when life reminded her of how fragile it all was, she would look at me differently. Maybe she would open the box, or maybe she wouldn't. But when that day came, I wanted to be the kind of man who could still stand tall, still offer love without bitterness, still hold himself with quiet dignity. I whispered into the empty room, "I'll be here." The box gleamed faintly in the lamplight, silent and still, but for the first time all night, I no longer felt mocked by its silence. Instead, I felt challenged to live, to endure, to love, even if it went unanswered. And as I finally turned out the light and climbed the stairs, I carried with me the weight of both sorrow and strength. Sorrow for what had been lost, strength for what might yet be found. The story was not over. Not for me. Not for her. Not yet. Months passed, and though the snow melted into streams that trickled down the sidewalks, the cold inside me lingered. On the surface, life carried on as it always did. I tended the small garden behind my house, exchanged polite words with neighbors, and watched the seasons shift as if nothing monumental had happened. But deep within, something remained unsettled. That little red box was gone from my hands, its contents no longer mine to give. I had already transferred the house, signed, sealed, and entrusted to a young couple who had been struggling to make ends meet. They cried when I handed them the keys, their gratitude overflowing in a way that reminded me of a kind of warmth I had longed to see in my own family's eyes. It gave me solace at the time, but also an ache. This gift had been meant for my daughter. Then one evening, as spring's first rains pattered gently against my windows, my phone rang. The name flashing on the screen startled me. Sarah. She had been Claire's friend since childhood, practically part of the family once. My hand trembled slightly as I answered. Her voice was hesitant, almost guilty. Mr. Reed, I'm not sure if I should be the one to tell you this, but Claire, she just found out about the house. My chest tightened. I set the phone down on speaker, my hands pressing flat against the table as if steadying myself against a sudden storm. She knows. Yes, Sarah said softly. She heard from one of the neighbors near the new house. They mentioned how lucky that young couple was, that someone had gifted them the property outright. They told Claire the truth, that it was you. She didn't believe it at first, but then she broke down. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. My throat felt clogged, heavy. I wanted to ask what Claire said, how she reacted, but Sarah didn't wait for me to form the words. She cried, "Mr. Reed." She kept repeating, "That gift was meant for me. He gave it to me, and I didn't even open it. She regrets it more than anything." When I finally saw Claire days later, the image of her nearly undid me. My daughter, who so often carried herself with confidence, now looked fragile, like the little girl I once held when she scraped her knee. Her eyes were swollen from tears, her lips trembling as if she had practiced what to say 100 times but could never get it right. "Dad," she whispered, almost inaudibly. Then louder, with desperation, "Dad, why didn't you tell me what was in that box?" I looked at her, my own heart aching with both love and disappointment. "Claire," I began, my voice rough, "I did tell you. Not in words, but in the act. I placed it in your hands. I gave you the chance. All you had to do was open it." Her face crumpled. She shook her head violently, tears streaming again. I thought it was just another small gift. Something sweet, something simple. I didn't think it could be. Her voice broke. I didn't think it could be a house, Dad. A home. I swallowed hard, each word I wanted to say, feeling like shards of glass. That's the problem, Claire. You didn't see me. You didn't even give me a chance. You set it aside before you knew what it was. Just like sometimes you set me aside. Her sobs grew louder. She stepped toward me as if to close the distance, but I held up a hand gently, not to reject her, but to steady the moment. "Do you know what I wanted most that day?" I asked softly. "It wasn't for you to have a new house, or for me to be generous. I wanted to see your face light up. I wanted to see you feel loved and secure, to know that no matter what storms came, you'd always have shelter. That was my dream as a father. And instead," my voice cracked. "Instead, I walked away with the box still sealed." Claire covered her mouth with both hands, as if trying to hold in her regret. Between sobs, she whispered, "I've been so blind. Dad, I was proud. I was careless. I thought I thought saying no would prove something, that I didn't need help, that I was strong. And all it did was throw away the one gift that mattered most. I felt my eyes sting, but no tears fell. Perhaps I had already cried them in silence, in all those lonely nights, replaying the moment in my mind. I reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Claire, I can forgive your pride. I can forgive the mistake. But what I can't give back is time. The house is no longer mine to offer. It belongs to someone who treasures it, someone who opened the gift without hesitation. And that is what hurts the most." Her shoulders shook as the weight of my words settled. She leaned into me, hugging me tighter than she had in years. For the first time in a long while, I felt her heart pressing against mine. And though it should have been healing, it also tore me apart. Because I knew this embrace came too late for the gift I had intended. That night, long after Claire left, I sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. Each flicker seemed to remind me of choices, of roads taken or missed. I thought of the unopened box, of the golden ribbon she never untied. Regret is a strange thing. It doesn't erase love, but it stains it. It makes what could have been shimmer painfully in the distance, forever out of reach. Claire now knew the truth, but the truth came wrapped in loss. And in that moment, I realized the lesson wasn't only hers, it was mine too. Sometimes, no matter how much we love, no matter how carefully we plan, life reminds us that love must be accepted in its time, or it risks slipping away. The climax had come not in anger, nor in dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet recognition that what was broken between us could never be exactly the same again. It could heal, yes. It could grow new roots. But the house, the symbol of safety and devotion, was gone. And so I sat in silence, heart heavy, realizing that Christmas morning would forever echo in our lives as the day my daughter returned a gift unopened. The days after Claire's breakdown felt strangely suspended, like the world had slowed down just to let both of us breathe. For the first time in years, she called me every evening, not to ask for advice, not to request help, but simply to hear my voice. At first, the conversations were clumsy, filled with pauses and half-formed sentences, but slowly, they began to soften. She told me about work, about Daniel, about little things she would normally never bother to share. It was as if she was relearning how to let me back into her life. And yet, underneath the warmth of those calls, I could feel the shadow of regret haunting her words. Each laugh was tinged with hesitation, each story brushed with a guilt she could not name aloud. It was the kind of guilt that grows when you realize something precious slipped through your fingers, not because life was cruel, but because of your own choice. I never once mentioned the house again. I couldn't. To reopen that wound would have been to rob both of us of the fragile new bridge we were building. Instead, I listened. I asked questions. I gave her space to remember that a father's love did not vanish with a missed opportunity. One afternoon, a few months later, she came by unannounced. I heard the knock at the door and found her standing there with no makeup, her hair tied back loosely, her eyes red as if she'd been crying before she even left the car. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "Can I come in?" I nodded, stepping aside. She walked in and, without a word, went straight to the kitchen table, the same table where I had once set down that unopened box. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the wood grain as though it still bore the outline of the ribboned gift. "Finally," she whispered, "every time I sit at a table, Dad, I think about that morning. I think about how I smiled and pushed it back toward you. I can't stop replaying it." I sat opposite her, my hands folded calmly. I replay it too, I admitted. But do you know what I see now? Not the box, not even the gift. I see your face, Claire. The hesitation, the distance. That was what truly broke me. Not that you didn't open a present, but that you didn't trust the hands that gave it. She began to cry openly, shoulders shaking. I was so proud. I didn't want Daniel to think I was weak, leaning on you. I wanted to prove I was strong, that we could build our life without anyone's help. And instead, I shut you out. I reached across the table, taking her hand gently. Pride is part of growing. Mistakes are part of living. What matters is not what we lose, but what we learn. Her grip tightened. For the first time in years, I felt the warmth of her hand clinging to mine, as though it was her only anchor. Time, I've learned, does not erase wounds, but it can wrap them in softer layers. Claire began to visit more often, sometimes with Daniel, sometimes alone. Each visit carried traces of unspoken apologies, but also small acts of love. She cooked dinner in my kitchen. She tidied the shelves she once ignored. She lingered in my living room long after the conversations had ended, as if the silence itself was her way of saying, I missed this. I missed you. And slowly, I realized something profound. The unopened box had become more than a symbol of loss. It had become a turning point. Because she hadn't opened it, because regret now haunted her, she was finally forced to confront what mattered. The bond between us. Not the property, not the wealth. The house itself stood on another street now, filled with laughter from a family who cherished it. And though it pained me at first to drive past it, to see children running in the yard that I had once imagined for Claire, I began to find peace in it. That gift still mattered. It was still love, still protection. It simply found a different home. Months turned into a year. On the anniversary of that Christmas morning, Claire invited me to her house. I hesitated at first. Memories pressed hard against my chest. But when I walked in, I was met not with distance, but with warmth. She hugged me immediately, whispering, "Thank you for not giving up on me." The table was set. The lights glowed softly, and in the center, resting between the dishes, was a small red box. My breath caught. It wasn't the same one, of course, but the ribbon, the velvet, she had recreated it. With trembling hands, she slid it toward me. "This time," she said softly, "I'm the one giving." Inside, folded neatly, was a handwritten letter. I opened it, my eyes blurring before I even read the first line. "Dad, I can never change the past. I can never open the box you gave me that morning. But I want you to know that I see it now, and I see you. I will not waste another gift, another moment, another chance to open my heart to you. I love you." By the time I finished reading, tears were sliding freely down my cheeks. Claire leaned over, her arms wrapping around me, and in that embrace, I felt something shift. Not erasure, not perfect healing, but renewal. The aftermath of pain is rarely clean. Regret will always linger in some corner, whispering what might have been. But as I held my daughter close, I realized that perhaps the unopened gift had been necessary. Perhaps only through that missed chance could she truly understand the depth of my love, and the cost of letting pride stand in its way. I lost a house that day, but I gained something greater. A daughter who finally knew what it meant to open the invisible gifts a father gives every day. Patience, forgiveness, and unwavering love. And for me, that was enough. I folded the letter once more and set it back on the table, but my hands lingered over it as if afraid to let go. The paper was ordinary, just ink and fiber. But to me it felt heavier than any deed or contract I had ever signed. For years I had measured my worth in houses, saving, accounts that no one ever saw. Now, with her words etched across these pages, I realized the only currency that had ever truly mattered was love that went unspoken and forgiveness that had waited too long to be asked for. That evening, I walked slowly around my house. The walls hummed with silence, but it was not the same hollow quiet I had known before. There was a warmth to it now, faint but unmistakable, like the lingering notes of a hymn after the choir had gone. I touched the frame that held her childhood photo, the one where her hair was tangled from playing in the snow, cheeks flushed with joy. For the first time in years, I smiled at it without the ache of regret tightening in my chest. I imagined the future, not the grand gestures or hidden keys, but something simpler. Sunday dinners where laughter replaced silence. Phone calls where no one counted the minutes. Even moments of disagreement, but softened with understanding rather than distance. It was a fragile dream, yes, but it was mine, and it was hers too. When I finally turned off the lights and let the night settle, I kept the letter by my bedside, not because I feared losing it, but because I wanted it near, an anchor for the days ahead, a reminder that even unopened gifts can one day reveal their meaning if the heart is ready to receive them. And as I drifted toward sleep, I whispered to the dark, "She knows now. That's enough." The months that followed were not perfect, but they were real. And that, for me, was enough. I no longer woke each morning measuring the silence in my home, wondering what had slipped through my fingers. Instead, I woke to a rhythm of visits, of shared meals, of laughter echoing softly through rooms that had long forgotten what joy sounded like. Claire began to invite me into her world, not only as a father, but as a presence she could lean on. At first it was small. Sunday dinners, quick calls on her way home from work, a seat saved for me at Daniel's company events. But over time, I saw the change deepen. She no longer looked at me as someone on the outside of her life, but as someone who belonged at the center of it. One spring afternoon, she took me to see the garden she had planted behind her house. Rows of flowers stretched along the fence, their colors bursting against the fading daylight. "I planted them for you," she admitted quietly, "because you always told me beauty takes patience. I never understood that until now. I didn't need keys or deeds to know I was home." Her words, her gestures, her presence, they were the true inheritance I had been waiting for. As the seasons turned, my health grew frailer, but my heart grew lighter. I no longer carried the weight of being unseen. When neighbors waved, they didn't see a lonely old man. They saw a father walking proudly with his daughter. The true miracle, I realized, was not that Claire had finally opened her heart, but that I had lived long enough to see it. Many fathers leave this world with apologies unspoken, with bridges never rebuilt. I was given the rare grace of healing while still here to feel it. On my 76th birthday, Claire and Daniel hosted a small gathering in their home. Friends, colleagues, and family filled the rooms. At the center of the table was a cake, not extravagant, just simple and warm. Before anyone cut it, Claire stood and raised her glass. Her voice trembled, but it carried strength. "To my father," she said, "who gave me gifts I didn't deserve, who forgave mistakes I didn't admit, and who loved me when I was too proud to love him back. Today, I want the world to know I am proud to be his daughter." Applause erupted, but I barely heard it. Tears blurred my vision as she walked to me and kissed my cheek. In that moment, I understood. The true happy ending was not wealth regained or pride avenged, but a bond restored, a love reclaimed. And as the night wound down, I sat among the people who mattered most, holding my daughter's hand in mine. For the first time in decades, I felt utterly complete. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like. So I know you stayed with me until the end. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Every week, I'll bring you a new journey filled with emotions, surprises, and powerful life lessons. And don't forget to comment below. What did this story make you think about in your own life? I always read every single message because your support is what gives me the strength to keep sharing these stories. Thank you for staying until the very last moment. Nust.